Okay, so it's a few minutes after 6, so I'm going to just start with the introduction. Maria, if you want to just not share your screen. Thank you. So I'm going to just share my screen in a moment. But first of all, I want to say welcome to the LSE Library for this online event. My name is Dr. Debbie Chalice, and I'm very pleased to welcome Rachel Holmes and Naomi Paxton to LSE Library for this event today. Dr. Rachel Holmes is author of Eleanor Marx, A Life, serialised on BBC Radio 4, Book of the Week, and shortlisted for the James Tait Black Prize. New editions of her biographies, The Secret Life of Dr. James Barry from 2002, and The Hottentot Venus, The Life and Death of Sarah Baartman, 2006, were published in 2021. Her acclaimed biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, which is the topic of conversation tonight, was published last year in 2020. Dr. Naomi Paxton is a performer, writer, broadcaster and researcher. In 2018, her monograph Stage Rights, the Actresses Franchise League, Activism and Politics was published by Manchester University Press, and she edited a second collection of suffrage plays in Bloomsbury entitled The Methuen Drama Book of Suffrage Plays, Taking the Stage, which launched at the National Theatre as part of the Courage Everywhere season. Last but not least, her card game Suffragette also launched at the National Theatre, and there is, of course, a card for Sylvia Pankhurst. But we are here today. We are here today to talk about Sylvia Pankhurst, and more specifically, as there is so much to say about Sylvia Pankhurst, as Rachel's biography shows, it's quite large. How many? I think it's 700 pages. Yes, thank you. So to start this event, I want to just share my screen. So I'll put it up here. We go with this object from the LSE, the Women's Library, I should say, at LSE Archives. Now this shows the Suffrage tea set, I should say, not just teapots, a whole tea set. It's one of our most sought after items in the Women's Library collection. It's actually rarely in our archives because it's often out on loan. It was on loan to Tait for their exhibition on Sylvia Pankhurst. It was on loan to the V&A for Icons of Design exhibition, so it's often out on loan. And basically, just to give you a few more close-ups of it, so you can have a good look at it. It's got the WSPU logo on it, which I suspect we'll hear a bit more about shortly. And there you go. So it's not something that we normally see actually at LSE because it's often not there. And it's an icon of politics and arts, but also the artistry of a functional item. So I'm going to finish with this photograph, and I'm going to hand over now to Rachel and Naomi, and I'm really looking forward to their conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. Shall I go?
Yes, go for it.
Great. Thank you very much for that very warm and welcome introduction, and hello and good evening to you all. Sylvia Pankhurst intended to be an artist, not an activist. A couple of contextual quotes I was thinking about. A painting by you is equivalent to an army regiment, said General Franco to Picasso, who of course refused to paint him one. And this from John Berger. And if the aesthetes jump at this confession to say that it proves that I am a political propagandist, I am proud of it. But my heart and I have remained those of a painter. And I think that speaks very precisely to the relationship between Sylvia Pankhurst's art and activism. When I showed this photo that that Debbie's kindly put up to Helen Pankhurst, Sylvia's granddaughter, she wrote, from the whole life in 900 pages to a tea set. And I think that was very astute. It's like Eliot's Prufrock. I've measured out her life with coffee spoons. The biographer has no choice. It's literally our job. And in Sylvia Pankhurst's case, there are a lot of spoons. A lot of spoons. Throughout her robust and very long life, Sylvia was a great stirrer, probably the greatest, to my mind, greatest political stirrer in Britain in the early 20th century. And Helen Pankhurst, as ever astute remark, she's uncannily like her grandmother, reminded me that the intersection between Sylvia's art and activism was the fertile fact, as Virginia Woolf calls these moments, that started my work on her. The prompt, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." And the place we start here then is this beautiful tea set, this practical, as Debbie says, this practical functional object, but so beautiful, so imaginative. And the lithograph stamp that you can see, Sylvia's Angel of Freedom, on this suffragette tea service. That feminist angel trumpeting women's rights and freedoms in white, purple, and green was reproduced across many different mediums and objects during the suffragette struggle of the first 2 decades of the 20th century and beyond. And could I have the first image, please? Sylvia studied, you can see her here in her studio, at the Manchester School of Art, where she was lectured by Walter Crane and mentored by the Ancoats Brotherhood. She won a string of prizes and an award of a travel bursary to go to Venice, where she rose at 5 every morning to paint on the bridges and in the markets. She caused consternation and chaos at the Academia by applying to study in the all-male life class. When the tutor ignored her requests, she simply turned up early one morning, set up her easel in the studio, and refused to budge, effectively a sit-in or a stand-in. In the end, her Italian tutors were so impressed by the young British woman, there was a diploma waiting for her in the post when she got back to Manchester. She won an extremely competitive scholarship to go to the Royal College of Art in London, where she studied from 1904. Her studies went well, she was talented, but she got into dispute with the principal of the college over the rights of women students, including getting Keir Hardie, by that time her lover, to raise a question in Parliament about why the numbers of women students fell off a cliff when it came to graduate awards. Branded a troublemaker for trying to reform the institution, this was one of her first direct grapples of the tension and dilemma between practicing her art and activism. It wasn't only the fights within the institution, but her responsibilities without. Her highly demanding mother, Emmeline, sent endless directives telling her to campaign, leaflet, pamphlet. This was before there was a WSPU branch in London. Sylvia was to set one up. She had a little studio in what was then known as long-haired bohemian arty Chelsea. And at the weekends, her friends from the college gathered there to paint and do still lives together. But when her mother instructed Sylvia to rouse London, she had to give up the studio space for it to become the HQ of the first London branch of the Women's Social and Political Union. Activists from Lancashire, Scotland, and around the country came to stay with her. It became a commune, a barracks, and her easel was pushed to the wall. There's another aspect of Sylvia's artistic inheritance I want to briefly emphasize because I think it's too often overlooked. And this aspect is crucial to my mind, to the way that women inherit craft, creative folklore, business and creative skills from our mothers, from our families, in ways that are not part of officially recognized and usually male-dominated artistic or intellectual institutions of art, of learning. Sylvia's mother, Emmeline, had a great flair for design, style, and colour, for making homes, for what in this precise period of history would emerge as the British interior design revolution, mostly under the inspirational leadership of William Morris, whose edict "Beautiful and Useful" Sylvia exemplifies. Emmeline ran a financially disastrous business called Emerson & Co., selling interior objects and furnishings collected in Britain, but also from Italy and France. This sounds like a completely normal idea now, but it was completely innovative and novel. Christabel and Sylvia were put to work in the stores, which had various different manifestations, both in London and Manchester. Christabel did very little except put her feet up on the furniture and read novels, but Sylvia rolled up her sleeves and got involved. And Emmeline did extraordinary things in their homes as well, painting walls bright colours and designs, making upholstery in unusual inspired fabrics. And I really think that this aspect of home furnishing, design, personal expression and the lived environment is equally important to the Sylvan tradition as going to the RCA. Could I have the next image, please? Thank you. In 1907, a political falling out with her mother and her elder sister Christabel became an opportunity for Sylvia for her to pause her full-time activist work and tour England and Scotland, painting, drawing, interviewing, recording the lives of British working women. She met and lived with women chain makers, nail makers, potters, shoemakers, fisherwomen, pithead lassies at the collieries, workers in the cotton spinning industry. You can see here this beautiful image of a woman changing a bobbin in a cotton mill, potato pickers. And this immersive tour, painting and documenting working class women's lives, was unprecedented. There was nothing else like it from the period. And its quality and importance cannot be underestimated or overstated. Here, Sylvia combines the skills of the artists with a method of the social scientist. She took notes, she interviewed, she took the data on wages right down to the minutiae of the clocking in and the clocking out and the working conditions, the quality of the air, whether the windows were open or closed. But she also painted and drew these extraordinary and beautiful images. A few years ago, Maria Balshaw at the Tate Modern acquired 4 of these unutterably beautiful works for the Tate Modern from the Pankhurst family. And I think it's no accident that it takes the first woman director of a great British modern art institution to do this. And I also want to mention the artist and animator Joan Ashworth, who is just completing a wonderful new film about Sylvia's art that offers a visual history and journey through this northern tour, amongst other aspects of Sylvia's career. And I urge you to take the opportunity to see it when it's released later this year. Could I have the next image? Thank you. The designs and objects that Sylvia produced for the WSPU during the suffragette period demonstrate how she combined her fine art training, artistic talent, and political understanding that she gained from practical activism and her own political history. Here you can see, this is the membership card for the WSPU. It's a gouache printed in bright colors. Note that this is a procession of working women in clogs, shawls, barefoot, carrying babies and water pails. The message is clear. And I love to think about how every member of the WSPU had one of these, this beautiful object. Where did they keep it? Some would be able to display it. Others would have to hide it from their families, from their husbands, from their brothers. When Sylvia was a child, her mother had shown her and had kept her parents' anti-Corn Law League membership cards. They were sometimes on the mantelpiece, and they're now in the archive. You can see them in the archive in Amsterdam, and they were a prized family inheritance. And I think they were part of the inspiration of Sylvia seeing these beautiful political membership cards that inspired this. The next image, this one is from 1909, and you're going to have to use your imagination here and fill this with color, because these were just from rescued photographs that were accidentally discovered. In 1909, Sylvia decorated the women's exhibition held in the Prince's skating rink in Knightsbridge. She decorated a 250 by 150 foot hall in 12 weeks with a great collective crew. Some of them were mates from college. The decorations, picked out in keynote colors of purple, white, and green, took for their theme Psalm 126, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." And this colossal symbolic tableau and motifs transformed the hall and created a festival for women and their supporters, amidst flights of doves, olive branches, spring daisies, daffodils, wildflowers, briar roses, grapes, and butterflies. And amidst this were stalls dedicated to political themes, an exhibition of contemporary press photographs, and Sylvia's really pet idea, a scale replica of a Holloway prison cell that you could sit in alone. The next image shows Sylvia decorating the storefront of the East London Federation of Suffragettes in Bow. And you'll see that she's standing on this scaffold, and there are other images of her facing the other way, addressing crowds and orating from that same scaffold. And I like that sort of dual purpose. You'll see that she's painting "Votes for Women" in the legend above the windows in beautiful Roman lettering in real gold leaf paint. Nothing too good for the workers. Bread, and roses too. Imagine how it must have shone and glowed, inviting curious women and girls to cross the threshold. Now, during this period, Sylvia engaged in an enormous amount of public art. She became the visual choreographer of a festive, ingenious, and physically hardy movement. There was music, theatre, arts, festivals, dance, fashion, pop-up shops selling banners, bags, badges, some of them printed with the image of Emmeline and Christabel. And there was Muriel Matters dropping her £56 of illustrated pamphlets over London, and the suffragette steamship patrolling the Thames with its streaming pennants of purple, white, and green. And this gives us a sense of the political theatre, the greatest, I think, since the French Revolution and the Chartist uprisings here in Britain. In 1910, there were over 4,000 demonstrations, and Sylvia was put in charge of the visual choreography of many of these, and she created heraldic designs, border decorations, liberty caps, banners, bunting. She claimed there was no great artistry in the work, which required mass production in double quick time. So I think we sort of get that sense of that productivity and of the use of these things to run the campaign. And there was this wide scale production of public art, but nevertheless, as Sylvia said, it was true to say that the creation of a Michelangelo would have ranked low in the eyes of the WSPU members, beside a term served in Holloway. This next image it was a self-portrait over a period of 2 years, roughly between 1912 and 14. Sylvia was in and out of prison, mostly Holloway, which became a kind of grotesque second home for her and indeed many other suffragettes. She was force-fed and hunger-struck more than any other suffragette. And this is a self-portrait of a couple, which are very beautiful in her prison uniform. Of course, she did not do this in prison since she was forbidden artistic materials for most of her sentences. But surprising as it may sound now, Sylvia was not by nature a fighty person, despite being fearless, terrifyingly brave, in fact, and tortured by force feeding and hunger. She was, by her own admission, an extremely reluctant militant. And it's worth pausing to remember how hard people have to be driven to become militant, to know that the only way to obtain just law is to break unjust laws, to be desperate for freedom, to have no choice. As is well remembered, art attacks were a highly effective PR weapon deployed by the suffragettes. Think of Mary Richardson attacking Velázquez's Rokeby Venus at the National Gallery in March 1914. Paintings at the Royal Academy and Manchester Art Gallery were also attacked. This is really nothing compared to, like, you know, sellotaping or supergluing yourself to a motorway. In 1913, Sylvia threw a lump of cement at a painting in St. Stephen's Hall in the Palace of Westminster. The object of her art attack was a recently hung painting by Andrew Gow, which she wrote was feebly unattractive, and more importantly, covered by a great expanse of resistant glass. That would serve, she wrote, the picture in any case would not suffer. So she even worried about actually damaging a painting that she didn't really rate very highly. She flung her piece of cement, we can imagine, rather half-heartedly, and it bounced off, leaving the painting undamaged and the cement shattered on the flagstone floor. The next image, I'm actually going to skip. It's a New Year pageant with the junior suffragettes in London, but for the purposes of time, I'm going to move to the next one. And this is the famous Portcullis and Broad Arrow medal that Sylvia designed. It was awarded to suffragettes who served in prisons, who served prison sentences. She created it around 1909, and it depicts the famous prison gates of Holloway Prison and the arrow that marked all prison uniforms, enameled in, as you can see, in suffragette colours. Sylvia had a visual symbolic obsession with this arrow that appeared in all sorts of designs and drawings that she did. And she used it also to create banner holders and lecterns, and it appears in many forms. The WSPU commissioned Toy, Kenning and Spencer Limited of London to manufacture the medals. Founded in 1685, the company supplied gold and silver laces, insignia and broidery by appointment to the Crown. And in 2018, the Museum of London commissioned a limited edition of replicas from the company, which is still going. This is mine. I don't know if I'm holding it in the right place in the camera. It was my 50th birthday present from my mother. And if you could see here, it was made still by Toy Kenning and Spencer, the same company who'd made the original medals. Strangely, I find that I don't really wear it because it feels odd to wear it having not earned it with the prison sentence, which was not a reaction I expected, but that somehow has happened. I'm going to move to the final, oh, sorry, there's one penultimate image. Sylvia produced newspapers throughout her life. We see one here in the next image, which is from the Workers' Dreadnought. We got that one. I think we're still on the Portcullis and Arrow Brooch. Well, I'll move on and talk about the newspapers anyway. Sylvia had a whole other life as a newspaper editor, publisher and producer. And as children, she and Christabel and Adela produced the Home News and Universal Mirror. And as the adult, there was a string of newspapers, the Suffragette, the Women's Dreadnought, which became the Workers' Dreadnought. And later, Sylvia published and edited the New Times and Ethiopia News, known colloquially in the 1930s as the National Anti-Fascist Weekly. We could do with it now. And her last paper, a journal, was the Ethiopia Observer. And I think as a newspaper editor and publisher, she also illustrated herself, but often more frequently commissioned artists to illustrate her papers. And those were very important parts of her art as well. And the final image, it may have dropped out, I can't see it, but throughout Sylvia's career, she was preoccupied with dancing and capturing feet. Just she would do studies of feet. Something that Naomi is very taken with as well. And they dance through the archive. They're everywhere. You come across them. And for me, this image represents all the drawings and paintings of women, including those unfinished and unstarted that Sylvia did throughout her life. And these dancing feet, another of her thematic obsessions, represent all the paintings that she did not do because ultimately of the demands of activism. And she did many studies for a large piece she wanted to create of women and girls dancing in a sylvan grove in Epping Forest, a great big piece, but she never did it. And when I look at this image of the dancing feet, I think of Sylvia marching always on her feet, putting aside her brushes alongside thousands of other women to fight for the right of future girls and women to have the opportunity to become artists in their own right.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Debbie, for managing to get back online and show us the image of the dancing feet there. Thank you for that fantastic and brief overview, and I do recommend this astonishing and beautifully written book to you, just for the breadth of Sylvia's life as well as the depth of Rachel's research. So what I'm going to do now, Rich, is just ask you a few questions based around this. We'll keep probably hopefully try and get the last sort of 10 minutes or so for audience questions if there are any. And yes, do put them in the Q&A box. I think I've answered the one about the potteries, but if you have any question, please do put them in the Q&A box. So I just wanted to say, in the preface actually to this book, you describe the Pankhurst sisters as teen radicals, and sort of liken them to the sort of articulacy and the single-mindedness of Malala and Greta Thunberg. So can you just tell us a little bit more about Sylvia's childhood awareness of activists and activism and her relationship with her parents? How did she get involved in this, and why did she get involved in it so young?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And yeah, I think we can say that it's really in her DNA, and it's important that she's born into in Manchester. She's born into a family where she has a very political mother and a very political father. They're both her mother and her father are radicals. Her father in particular was known as the Red Doctor for his his radicalism. He was a barrister, a socialist, a Republican, and had made, not unsurprisingly, several failed attempts to stand for Parliament. And it was he who radicalized his wife, Emmeline, who was 20 years his junior, very common at the time when they married. But Emmeline herself came from a very political family. And not inconsequentially, from, you know, she had ancestors from the Isle of Man, which is significant in terms of women's rights. But her, as I mentioned, in terms of the anti-Corn Law cards, her on her side, there were trenchant Chartists in the family, and so this combination. In their marriage, before their children were born, they were involved, they were very, very committed to anti-slavery and anti-racism, and to socialism. It's really important to remember, it's because it's very easy to forget, because Emmeline lost her socialism, as did Christabel, and they both turned away from it, that really up until pretty much just, you know, the sort of 1910s, they were very, very you know, completely socialist, and that the foundation of the Women's Social and Political Union initially came out of exclusively members of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party. This is a fact which is very conveniently overlooked, and because Emmeline, like, literally airbrushed it out of her own memoirs in later life, it sort of, you know, doesn't get reproduced. So in terms of that family DNA, they were right in it. And from the age of 9, when Emmeline and Richard were leafleting, whether it was against the Imperial Boer War, for which all the children got beaten up, and in fact their son, Sylvia's brother, was knocked unconscious and had to be brought home. She got books thrown at her for opposing that war. They were putting out leaflets on the seats, and they were, you know, it was just always there. And so it was only, it wasn't even a matter of time. And Sylvia would go with her father, who used to go and stand outside and speak at factory gates, and he would go with her, she would go with him and stand in the rain and do that. But equally, all of the daughters, and indeed Harry the son, would ask if they could, you know, accompany their mother and father to meetings. So I think it's something that it's not something that they came to external to the family. It was very much inside the family.
Thank you. And you mentioned she could have had an alternative career as a newspaper editor, you say in the book. And so she's obviously her involvement, her interest in writing from an early age. So the Home News, I think the first newspaper for the family. So she goes on to write for newspapers and eventually edit newspapers. But she also has a tremendous amount of correspondence, as well as the memoirs that she wrote. How have you managed to navigate through the enormous amount of written material that she produced in her lifetime in terms of developing this biography?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. There's a Hermione Lee in her magisterial biography of Virginia Woolf talks who has a very, very big archive as well. Talks about you know, those days when you'd wake up with literally archive fatigue, you know, this kind of this sort of complete overwhelmedness. And very interesting, the Virginia Woolf analogy is important, I think, Naomi, in relation to talking about women as historical subjects, because even when I was a student in the 80s, what was known of the Virginia Woolf archive was the tip of an iceberg. And even shortly before that, there had been very, very little. And if you look at how it accrues and more is discovered, and this is the same with many of these subjects. I found it with Eleanor Marx. It's the same with Sylvia Pankhurst. I know that you find the same in your own work, is that we're constantly, there's the existing archive, but then there's the additive stuff. And yeah, the level of the correspondence. And of course, I think we understand quite easily now that people wrote notes and sent letters backwards and forwards, like we're sending text messages and emails, and wrote very fast, and there were many posts a day. And of course, we are now into the realm of the time of the telephone. We don't have the transcripts of telephone conversations, although there are some that were captured that were interesting, that are interesting. Yes, with sometimes fear and trepidation. Blood, sweat, and tears, you know, the usual. Yeah.
So you mentioned that some of her archive material is in Amsterdam. Is everything in Amsterdam, or have you been able to find other things? Have you discovered other things elsewhere during the research process?
Yes, I have. And in answer to your question, the British Library, much to their discredit, but there's a happy coda to this. Can you imagine if the British Library had been offered Winston Churchill's papers and turned them down? But when they were initially offered her papers, they said, no, thank you very much. The Dutch, the International Institute of Social History, which is the most absolutely wonderful, fantastic archive, said, we'll do it. And the Dutch government put up the money for the archiving of it. And not only did they do that, and this actually perhaps seriously and in a more scholarly way responds and addresses your question about how you do it. One of the things that the archive has done there is they prioritized the Sylvia Pankhurst papers amongst a number of other archives to fully digitize. And any of my friends who might be joining us this evening will know that there was some gnashing of teeth and you know and tears of sorts of rage when I but also great happiness when I discovered only months before I finished that the entire archive has been put online. But this is a way to tell you now, it is absolutely wonderful. You can go after this talk, you can go straight onto the International Institute of Social History. Don't have to go to Amsterdam, which is a shame because that would be nice to do, but and you can now dip in and you can look, you can read all the letters, all the manuscripts, everything is there in facsimile. And I think that accessibility, making the archive open and accessible is really one of the upsides of what the new technology has brought us.
What a fantastic resource! How amazing! I should be hot-footing it there after this.
It's really great. Yeah, just.
But were you in touch with the family as well?
Yes, who have been absolutely fantastic, and you know, it hardly needs rehearsing to say that any biographer or indeed historian who's approaching a subject with very living family, you know, it does so with much trepidation, and I think true to the spirit actually of Sylvia and the family and so on, they have been incredibly helpful and supportive, and you know, most particularly Helen Pankhurst has been absolutely terrific. And I went to Addis Ababa, went to Ethiopia to do research, and the best part of that was going to interview the late Rita Pankhurst in Sylvia's home, which was then her and her late husband Richard's home, Sylvia's only son, and talking to her, which was phenomenal, an honor and a privilege. And it should be said that this is an opportunity to say that Richard, Sylvia's son, incredibly important in being one of the first people to capture Sylvia's archive and to preserve his mother's legacy alongside Rita. And it's very, very interesting because Rita deserves her own books and movies. She's extraordinary. I mean, an amazing person, and the things that she did in Ethiopia and her contribution to Ethiopian education system and national culture and the National Library, extraordinary. And one of the things that's very interesting is that she writes about how she wasn't a feminist when she married Richard, and then became so through this working with Sylvia. And so I suppose to summarize, talking through that is a combination, isn't it? You go and fossick around in archives, but you also have to follow you have to follow the living, breathing trails as much as you can. I would say one thing, however, about digitization. There are always things that are not captured. It's just the nature of how it works. So I think that if you can get to archives And if you really need you want to go deeper, sometimes you do have to go and find things. With Eleanor Marx, I found something that had just been slipped between, you know, papers in the wrong place, and that happened with Sylvia as well. There was some stuff about Keir Hardie, but it had just been shoved in another book. So that will happen. And I did find, I suppose for me, the most striking find was what I call the toilet papers, which are in the special collections and the manuscript collections at the British Library. They were unsorted, and in short, they were sorted now because I sorted them out so I could transcribe them. Sylvia wrote secretly plays, letters, political correspondence, and some diaries on His Majesty's government standard issue toilet paper when during her imprisonment. This was later for sedition, almost
in the 1920s, early 19. Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time transcribing those and putting those together, and in there it is an almost complete 5-act play, which somebody really needs to put on.
Great, I'll get on that as well. Thank you very much. That's
just a little bit of a hint there. Somebody,
yeah, on it. Noted. I mean, we started with the tea set, which is astonishing, and her skills around branding particularly are really important. I mean, Emmeline Pettit-Lawrence sort of formulates that purple, white and green, and then I think the women's exhibition of 1909, which we saw those beautiful murals, and obviously there are many more, the pelican and her piety and the broad arrow design and all that stuff, just really solidifies those colours and the WSPU brand. And what I love about that is the angel, the trumpeting angel, the noise, the fact that it's not a delicate female figure, but a figure that is making noise and is making herself heard. I suppose the drawing of the dancer's feet, obviously we've got the Esperance Club, Mary Neal's Esperance Club, and women's labour. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about her trip around the UK, speaking to and drawing and spending time with working women and women's labour, and how important she felt that was to represent the working women as part of the suffrage campaign, and how that maybe differed from where the WSPU ended up going later on in the 1910s.
Yeah, well, that's nicely put, and actually, it's interestingly that artistic tour is in itself a political campaign to make a political point, because at the point where this happened, Sylvia and Christabel, who was at that point the leader of the movement, and Emmeline were arguing over the role of working women in the struggle for suffrage. And in short, this would be the issue, one of the issues over which they would bust apart. And put quite simply, Emmeline and Christabel had come to the conclusion that there could be a qualified vote, in other words, a middle-class women's vote, and the best people to represent the interests of women and get a foot in the door were middle-class women, and working women could wait till later. And Sylvia said, women are not free unless all women are free, and this is based on a socialist tradition. We have to remind ourselves constantly that effectively what that meant was that Christabel and Emmeline were saying middle-class women can have the vote, but not somebody's chauffeur, because not all men were enfranchised either. And I think so that it's really important to put it in the context of the question of the broader suffrage and franchise issue. And Sylvia over time saw this as a great betrayal, and this went on over time, and as you say, by the time they hit the war, it's become like absolutely that's what splits the movement. But in 1907, when she goes on this tour, she says, I will demonstrate why working women want the vote, because the argument was that had not been articulated, and as ever it was propaganda. I mean, it was liberal Tory propaganda that sort of said that there was no mass call, that it would that women on the ground did not want that, and was ignoring a so much longer history. So the tour that she did is it's amazing, really. And she beds in. She's, I mean, to use a rather ugly phrase, but she's embedded. She goes and lives with people. She stays with people. She goes into the factories. She talks and writes about how, very honestly, about just not even being able to cope and not being able to breathe and passing out. And she's like, look at me, all I have to do is sit here and try and draw some pictures, and I can't cope with this. How do these people work in this context? And
so, sorry, I know I'm very conscious of time, but can we just talk a little bit about the setting up of the East London Federation of Suffragettes? Because that was initially supported by the WSPU. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So initially, when Sylvia went to East London, the idea was to set up a chapter of the WSPU in East London. And actually, the objective was to bring the posh women from Kensington and from Chelsea and whatever, with the chapters that she was working in, down to East London to meet working women and to be informed and radicalized by them. Actually, the idea was to educate the middle class and the posh women to do that. And that was how it started, and it was supported, and the branch was paid for. But as this rift developed over the question of a qualified propertied vote for middle class women as opposed to votes for all women, that split apart. So the East London Federation of Suffragettes, the ELFs as it's known, which added to the purple, white and green socialist red because of its commitment to universal suffrage and to the values of equality and socialism, not just to the single issue of a women's vote, became that which was Sylvia's defining point. And yeah, and then ultimately she's thrown out really for that, and for her pacifism, for her opposition to what she considers the unjust First World War. But from that time she relocates to East London, and then she never goes back, and she goes further east. She goes to Woodford, and then eventually she goes to the heart of the revolution in Ethiopia, which of course is and at that time what's so exciting about her going to Ethiopia in the time that she does, and it's great, isn't it? Like, she emigrates and she becomes an immigrant in kind of like, her 70s, is that at that time it was an absolute explosion of art and visual art and music, and people were coming from all over the world. And so Ethiopia was very much a political and an artistic and intellectual and cultural hub. So it's like she keeps sort of moving towards the center, towards the future.
It's indefatigable. And please do put your questions for Rachel in the Q&A box, and we'll come to them later. I just wanted to ask about the differences. I mean, what comes through clearly, I think, in your book is that she very much believes in public displays of militancy as being effective, of sort of mass demonstrations and of those things being visible, and that increasingly then her sister and her mother kind of move into more covert things, so sort of secret bombings or destroying of personal property. I suppose there's a question there. I know there's a story about her persuading or sort of forcefully forcing Asquith to meet the working women of the East End and hear their testimonies. But what is it about the public protest, the visibility of that public protest, that she thinks is so strong and continues to then engage with over the rest of her life?
I'm so glad you asked that, and it's like, oh, there's like so many answers in there. But I think it's really, really important, because a mass protest, and I think this is incredibly important in terms of what we're facing at the moment with our right to protest fundamentally under threat, is solidarity. And one of the things that Sylvia was very concerned about, rightly, was that covert acts were fine if you had money and your family were not dependent on you to go home that night to feed them, to put the food on the table. So what concerned her was that whilst she supported and said yes, of course, she saw the need to have some kind of demonstrative, sort of qualified, if you like, sort of more direct action, but it was class. It was like a class differential, because with mass demonstrations, with public demonstrations, with literally the solidarity of linking arms and demonstrating and showing the voice, there is mutual reinforcement. But with the destruction of property, with individual covert actions, that, and also, like, it's easier to get away from those if you can do it in a car. Which is great, and some of the rich suffragettes had them and they used them. I mean, it's very important to point out about Sylvia, and it's one of the delights about her, is that she she was very prejudice free, and she had no class prejudice. She wasn't an inverse, you know, snob. She had lots of, in the East London Federation of Suffragettes that you asked about, Naomi, she was absolutely terrific, because when she started the Mother's Arms, which was her nursery in East London, opposite the gun maker, the gun making, the munitions factory where the women worked, and they drop off their babies, she got like these absolutely fabulously wealthy and brilliant, militant, rich women who, of course, who had inherited and could do what they liked with it. People like Nora Smythe and other people, and they would just like, and they would literally like take their dolls' houses from their, you know, their kids in Mayfair and say, look, you've got enough of these. Come, we're going to take them. And so there was a lot of that, like getting people to work together. And of course, remember in prison was, I always say, and I think it's very clear when you're studying it, that the suffragettes being in prison together was for the first time, many of them, the middle class and upper class women and the working women, got to meet each other and be on the level and interact, other than being each other's, you know, sort of mistresses and servants. And it was like the trenches, I think, that it did that thing. It was that thing that really began to break down class differences between women for the first time. But I think her emphasis was that public spectacle, and that came from the tradition of the anti-slavery movement, from the Chartists, the right to protest, the right for congregation, the right to make your presence felt in collective solidarity, and safety in numbers, to be able to protect yourself and to do that. And so that was her tension and her concern, that the impact, and you could see that it's very nicely done in the film Suffragette. I'm sure that many people perhaps joining in this conversation saw that, and I think that film demonstrates very well the economic vulnerability that people were subject to if they had to put themselves on the line, losing your children. Not only would your children go hungry, but you would lose your children. They would be taken away from you, or you'd be thrown away, thrown out of house home, unless you had
the privilege of being able to replace property that you've lost, or lose wages. So what did she do to make Asquith listen to those working women?
What didn't she do?
Well, I'm thinking of one particular time, I think.
Yeah, there's one particular time, and yes, so at one particular time, she just she as you said, she wanted to put this deputation of working women in front of Asquith, so that they could put their cases and he could hear them and actually have described to him their working lives. And actually one or two of the people who finally, when it did happen, because, and I'll quickly explain what she did, because she threatened to basically, die otherwise, were a couple of people you can see depicted in those Northern Tour pictures. So there are people in there, there are women in there who she met and who became part of the deputation. Asquith repeatedly refused. So they were fudging it and they were trimming and saying, yeah, we'll listen. And then they kicked it into the long grass, and she'd had enough. So eventually she said, no, I'm sick of this. And she had been doing a fair amount of hunger striking, so she was weak anyway. And I think she and furious. And so she went to Westminster, to the Palace of Westminster, and she lay down outside the Speaker's entrance, which I think is as it happens, near the statue of Cromwell. And she just literally said, that's it, I'm lying here, I'm not eating, I'm not drinking, either I am going to die as a martyr, or you are going to meet these women. And the notes went backwards and forwards, facilitated by Keir Hardie and other supporters, and Asquith relented. And it's very interesting, and it's really worth having a look at that. I mean, I've written about it in my book, but many other feminist historians and cultural commentators have written about it before. But actually looking at that deputation, what the women said, they took the objects of their trade, they took the brush maker and they described themselves, and Asquith was impressed, and he kind of said, I've never really heard or seen this before. And there is no doubt that it made an impression. And I think, going back to your previous point about class and diversity and how people work in a mutually reinforcing way, Sylvia understood her privilege. She came from a middle class family. No, she didn't have the opportunity of going to school or vote, but she understood that. And what she was good at, and what she saw as a responsibility, as a duty, was to use what privilege, what opportunity she had to get her foot in the door to create opportunity for other people, for other women, to push that door open, and then you go speak. Not I speak for you, but what can I do to facilitate that? And I think that was very much her modus. So whereas Christabel was like, literally says, we bourgeois women are the best people to speak on behalf of everyone because we speak nicely and we speak the language of power. And let's face it, these guys in Parliament, she says this, these guys in Parliament prefer looking at us easy on the eye, and let's utilize that, let's exploit that, and we will get these rights and freedoms on behalf of other women, and then we'll kind of pass them on when we got them. That was not Sylvia's way. Sylvia's way was to say, we already have a voice, our job is to create a platform for other people to have one.
And I think that comes across really clearly, for example, again in the women's exhibition, you said actually in your introduction about generations of women sharing, knowledge and arts and creativity, and that comes across, I think, really well in that exhibition, because there are so many women's crafts on display, and it's not shutting down a domestic, it's recognizing that a lot of women's crafts came out of the home because that's the option that they had, and celebrating that. So sort of whatever contribution you could make was of value to the movement in that example. This is your final chance, people, to put a question in the question box if you'd like to. I'm just going to ask you, Rachel, about the Statue for Sylvia campaign, because we must mention
yes, okay, the Sylvia, thank you so much. So yeah, Naomi and I want to remind you about the Sylvia Pankhurst statue campaign, which is really, really nearly reaching its fruition. And if you just put, Sylvia Pankhurst statue, you'll, in your web browser, you will find it. It's been cast. It's sitting in the yard of the foundry, waiting to be installed.
And where's it going to be installed?
And it's going to be on Clerkenwell Green. So if any of you, if you go up by Farringdon, very politically important place, because it's where the May Day demos, or one of them, kind of started. If you know where the Marx Memorial Library is, it's that green, which is historically very important, because it used to be a speaker's place and a place of congregation and all sorts of things that happened there, and that is the space where it's supposed to be. And the TUC has put a bunch of money, and there's just a little bit of a gap to find find some more money to complete it, so that the statue can be installed and put up there. And of course there's already several statues of Emmeline in various different places, and indeed of Christabel, but not that one yet of statue.
Oh, good. Thank you, Debbie, for putting that in the chat as well. So just an extraordinary life, from being born in Manchester in the 1880s to having a patriot's funeral in Ethiopia. We still haven't had any questions, so we get a bit more time. Tell us about the very end. Tell us about right at the other end of her life. Tell us a little bit about that.
The very end of her life. So actually, Sylvia Takes, and it was Rita that told me this, Rita Pankhurst, that when Sylvia emigrated with her son and her cat, their Siamese cat, which, by the way, made that cat the first cat to emigrate from Britain to Ethiopia, we're sure. Never got in a plane again, or a basket, you can imagine, after that. But she bought some brushes, and it's significant because she didn't have much money and she didn't spend on stuff. It wasn't her way. Unless it was, endless amounts of money for campaigning. And she took some brushes in the hope that she was going to be able to paint. And of course she didn't, because she just got completely involved and started again, and, was building, maternity hospitals and getting involved. And to go right to the end, as you say, Naomi, so there she is, born in Manchester. And think about it, she's born in the Victorian age in 1882 in Victorian Manchester, and she dies in Addis Ababa in 1960, and the Beatles are in the charts. It's this incredible duration and survival. And there she is, and she's literally working up to the last day. She doesn't go on a camping trip with her son and Rita, her daughter-in-law, because she's got a meeting in Parliament with actually one of the first women equivalent of MPs, representatives in the Ethiopian Assembly, to talk about women's issues that very day, and that is the day that she dies. So right up to the last minute she was working. Haile Selassie immediately, who was a friend and supporter Haile Selassie asked Richard Pankhurst, where would your mother like to be buried? I mean, obviously a great courtesy, because whatever was required would be arranged. Did the, you know, would the body be returned to Britain? What would you like? And Richard said he knew that she would wish to be interred, to be buried in Addis. And as you say, the most extraordinary funeral. And actually, you can, if you go on to, there's some Pathé newsreel, and you can find on YouTube, there's some tiny little clips. They're absolutely extraordinary. And she had, as you say, she was the first European to be given a patriot's funeral. It was a great honor, because the only other people, obviously, as the name indicates, were people who in patriots' graves, you know, who'd fought and won and defeated the Italians' fascist war.
Rachel, I'm going to have to interrupt you, I'm afraid, because we have one question. I'm sad to end on a note here about a man, but we have a question from Mandy that says, Asquith was still reported as being against votes for women. Asquith was the Prime Minister during that pre-war period, against votes for women in the 1920s. Can Asquith be redeemed?
No.
No, I would agree with you.
No, he was a complete trimmer, because actually he was a, I shouldn't have, you know, there's a problem being in
very briefly
screen, yeah, I'll get lots of rude words. No, because he would keep saying he was going to do, I mean, he did that classic thing, I'm going to do something, and as a consequence he put back potential change and the acceleration of change by years. So absolutely no.
I'd agree, and as another suffrage historian, I would also agree that he's unredeemable, I'm afraid. So that takes us to the end. Thank you so much for your time. Please do, if this has been interesting to you, please do get Rachel's book. It is phenomenal and phenomenally interesting. And thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time to present to us today. And thank you, Debbie and LSE, for putting this on in the first place. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Naomi. It's been great to chat with you.